Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 3 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the Craig family home in Aurora, Colorado, casting gentle light across the kitchen where Angela Craig prepared for another day. It was March 2023, and the 43-year-old mother of 6 had built what seemed like an enviable life. She and her husband James, a well-known dentist in the Denver suburb, had been married for 23 years, raising their children together while working side by side at his dental practice, Summerbrook Dental. To those who knew them, they appeared as two peas in a pod, a couple who played pranks on each other at the office and exchanged loving text messages throughout their busy days. Angela was the beloved youngest child in a large family of 10 siblings, born on April 15, 1979, in Dodge City, Kansas. She brought warmth and engagement to everything she touched, from her role as a hands-on office manager at her husband's practice to her devotion to their 6 children. Friends and colleagues remembered her as someone who never sat quietly in the background, always contributing ideas about marketing and messaging for the dental practice. The family had made Colorado their home for 15 years, and Angela seemed to have found her place in the world. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect marriage, darkness was gathering. In late February, James Craig attended a dental conference in Las Vegas, where he met Karen Kane, an orthodontist from Austin, Texas. What began as a chance encounter quickly evolved into something more, with the two exchanging over 4,000 messages in just 18 days. James created a new email account under the alias Jim and Waffles to communicate with her privately. He told Kane he had filed for divorce and was living separately in an apartment, though none of this was true. While Angela went about her daily routines at home and work, unaware of the betrayal, her husband was planning secret rendezvous and making travel arrangements with his new romantic interest. On the morning of March 6th, Angela woke feeling strangely unwell. From home, she sent her husband a text message that would later take on chilling significance. "My eyes don't want to focus," she wrote, followed by another message that stated simply, "I feel drugged." James immediately left Summerbrook Dental and drove home to check on her. Seeing that she was experiencing dizziness and weakness, he took her to the emergency room at Parker Adventist Hospital. The medical staff worked quickly to assess Angela's condition, running tests and monitoring her vital signs. Her symptoms were concerning, but the doctors struggled to pinpoint the cause. After hours of observation and examination, they found no definitive explanation for what was making her ill. With no clear diagnosis, the hospital released her to return home that same day. Angela seemed relieved to be going back to her family, texting James affectionately as she recovered on the couch. "Hi, baby. I love your face," she wrote, and he responded with equal warmth. "I love you. It was so nice hanging out with you and just watching a show and snuggling." The couple maintained their daily routines, including their morning workout ritual. James had always prepared protein shakes for Angela before they exercised together, a gesture that seemed thoughtful and caring. It was just part of their normal day, a small act of devotion in a long marriage. But within 24 hours of leaving the hospital, Angela's symptoms returned with frightening intensity. The dizziness, the weakness, the overwhelming sense that something was terribly wrong all came flooding back, and this time they were stronger. Angela returned to Parker Adventist Hospital on March 9th, and this time her condition was serious enough to warrant admission. As she lay in a hospital bed undergoing test after test, doctors found themselves confronting a baffling medical puzzle. Nothing in her medical history explained the constellation of symptoms she was experiencing. She suffered from severe headaches, dizziness, vomiting, and episodes of dangerously low blood pressure. The medical team tried various treatments, but nothing seemed to provide lasting relief. During her hospital stay, James appeared to be the model of a concerned husband. He texted Angela regularly, asking how she was feeling and expressing his worry. "I love you and miss you, and I'm so worried. I wish you were healthy enough to come home tonight and snuggle me," he wrote. He traveled back and forth between the hospital, their home, and his dental practice, seemingly juggling the responsibilities of caring for their 6 children while trying to support his ailing wife. To hospital staff and friends, he looked like a man under tremendous stress, trying to hold his family together during a crisis. James also reached out to Ryan and Michelle Redfern, longtime friends who had recently become more closely connected to the Craigs. Ryan Redfern, a fellow dentist, had known James since dental school more than 20 years earlier and had recently become his business partner at Summerbrook Dental. Michelle, trained as a nurse, received detailed text messages from James about Angela's condition. He shared information about her blood pressure readings and the doctor's concerns about symptoms that should have resolved but stubbornly persisted. Yet one message to Michelle stood out for its odd tone. "If it wasn't my wife, this would be kind of a fun puzzle to try to work out," he texted, adding an exclamation point. The comment seemed strangely detached, as though he was discussing an intellectual exercise rather than his wife's life-threatening illness. After 4 harrowing days in the hospital, during which her vital signs crashed one night while James reportedly slept on a stool beside her bed, Angela finally stabilized. On March 14th, still without any answers about what had caused her illness, the hospital discharged her. She went home once again to the husband she had loved and trusted for more than 2 decades, to the children who needed her, to the life she had built. She had no way of knowing that she would never leave that house under her own power again. Within a single day of returning home, Angela began feeling sick once more. On March 15th, her symptoms came roaring back with terrifying force. This time, her brother drove her to UC Health University of Colorado Hospital in Aurora, where she arrived at approximately 11 in the morning complaining of severe headaches and dizziness. James soon arrived at the hospital to be with her. His visit that day would mark the beginning of the end. Hospital records and security footage would show that James didn't stay long during his first visit. Within half an hour, he left the hospital and drove home. Then, about an hour and a half later, he returned carrying food. Surveillance cameras captured him entering Angela's hospital room alone. Shortly after that, Angela suffered a massive seizure and her vital signs plummeted. Medical staff rushed to her aid as her condition rapidly deteriorated. Within 3 hours of arriving at the hospital, Angela was experiencing such severe medical distress that doctors placed her on life support in the intensive care unit. James took photographs of his wife as she lay surrounded by tubes and monitors, her life hanging by a thread. He sent these images to Michelle Redfern along with stark, fragmentary text messages. "Crash," intubated, and Doc says she's very, very worried. When Ryan and Michelle Redfern rushed to the hospital, they found James in tears after speaking with doctors about Angela's grim prognosis. To anyone watching, he appeared to be a man watching his wife slip away, powerless to save her. But Ryan Redfern's mind was troubled by something that had nothing to do with the scene playing out in the hospital room. On his way to see the Craigs, he had received a disturbing phone call from a staff member at Summerbrook Dental. Days earlier, a package had been delivered to the dental office, addressed to James Craig. James had specifically instructed the staff not to open it, telling them it was personal. But someone had opened it anyway, and what they found inside sent chills through everyone who learned about it. The package contained potassium cyanide. Ryan Redfern knew that there was no legitimate dental purpose for potassium cyanide. As he stood in that hospital watching his old friend cry, a terrible suspicion began to take root. While Angela lay on life support, Ryan did something that would shatter decades of friendship. He approached a nurse and told her that James Craig had recently ordered potassium cyanide, and that there was no medical reason for a dentist to have such a substance. The nurse, bound by her duty as a mandatory reporter, immediately contacted the Aurora Police Department. Within 5 hours, a member of the homicide unit was at University Hospital asking questions. While investigators began their work, James called Ryan's cell phone. According to what Ryan would later tell police, James asked if he had said anything to hospital staff. Ryan confirmed that he had, and told James that he knew what James had ordered. James's response was that the package had contained a ring for Angela, that he had wanted to surprise her. But Ryan wasn't buying it. "It's not a ring," he told his former friend. "We know what was in there." The next morning, as Angela remained on life support with no brain activity, James sent Ryan a desperate text message pleading with him to stop cooperating with the investigation. "I want to make an urgent plea to you," he wrote. "Please don't talk to anyone, including any law enforcement officers. You are under no obligation to answer their questions unless you are served a subpoena, and you will do more damage than good to my family by continuing to insert yourself into this." But it was far too late. The investigation was already underway, and what detectives would uncover would paint a portrait of calculated murder. On March 18th, 3 days after she was placed on life support, Angela Craig was removed from the machines keeping her alive. She passed away that Saturday afternoon, leaving behind 6 children and a family devastated by loss. She was 43 years old. Hours after her death, police arrested James Craig and charged him with first-degree murder. The respected dentist who had treated patients and raised a family in Aurora now faced a life sentence for allegedly killing the woman he had promised to love and cherish. When Angela's autopsy results were released months later, they revealed the horrifying truth of what had happened to her. The medical examiner determined that she had died from lethal concentrations of cyanide and tetrahydrozoline, a chemical found in some over-the-counter eye drops and nasal sprays. Even more disturbing, the autopsy showed that during her 2 earlier hospital visits in early March, Angela had toxic concentrations of arsenic in her blood. The illness that had baffled doctors for more than a week wasn't a mysterious disease or an unlucky medical condition. Angela Craig had been systematically poisoned. As investigators dug deeper into James Craig's activities in the weeks before Angela's death, they uncovered a trail of damning evidence. Just a week before Angela first became ill, James had set up the Jim and Waffles email account. Using this alias, he had researched multiple poisons online, searching for information about how to kill someone without being detected. His search history included queries like, "How many grams of pure arsenic will kill a human?" "How to make poison?" and "Is arsenic detectable in an autopsy?" He had watched videos with titles such as "Top 5 Undetectable Poisons That Show No Sign of Foul Play." The digital trail showed that on the same day he conducted this sinister research, James ordered arsenic and had it delivered to his family's mailbox. A few days later, when the arsenic still hadn't produced the desired result, he ordered oleandrin, a deadly toxin found in the oleander plant. When that shipment was delayed after 3 days, he escalated to the most lethal substance of all, ordering potassium cyanide through a medical supply company. Because he was a licensed dentist with a DEA number, he had been able to purchase these lethal substances legally. The prosecution would argue that James Craig had spent 10 days methodically killing his wife. According to their theory, he had laced Angela's morning protein shakes with arsenic, causing the symptoms that sent her to the hospital on those first 2 occasions. The routine of preparing these drinks for her had provided the perfect cover, a seemingly loving gesture that masked deadly intent. Cyanide is tasteless, odorless, and colorless, making it ideal for concealing in a beverage. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the prosecution's case was what they alleged happened on March 15th, Angela's final day in the hospital. The autopsy had revealed something remarkable. The levels of cyanide in Angela's body had actually increased while she was hospitalized. Prosecutors argued that during James's visit to her hospital room that day, when he had been alone with her, he had administered a lethal dose of cyanide. Security footage showed him entering her room carrying what he claimed was food. Shortly after he left, Angela crashed. The prosecution also presented evidence of motive. James Craig's dental practice had filed for bankruptcy in 2020, and at the time of Angela's death, he had liabilities exceeding $2 million. Angela had life insurance policies worth approximately $3.4 million, with James as the sole beneficiary. Beyond the financial pressures, there was the affair with Karen Kane. While the relationship had lasted only about 10 days before Angela's death, investigators found that James had been actively planning trips with Kane, even as his wife lay dying in the hospital. The arrest affidavit noted chillingly, "It appears James was flying this woman into Denver while his wife and the mother of his children was dying in the hospital." James Craig pleaded not guilty to all charges. His defense team would argue that he was the victim of a rushed investigation, that police had concluded within 3 days that Angela had been poisoned and had never looked for alternative explanations. They suggested that James had been suicidal, not murderous, and that he had ordered the poisons for himself, not for Angela. The defense pointed to James's history of depression and past counseling, and claimed he had told a friend he planned to take his own life with something untraceable. The defense also raised the possibility that Angela herself had been suicidal, though none of her family members told police she had expressed such thoughts. They highlighted a text exchange in which Angela said she felt drugged, and James responded, "Given our history, I know that must be triggering. Just for the record, I didn't drug you." The defense suggested this referred to a past incident in which James had drugged Angela to prevent her from stopping one of his suicide attempts. They argued that the loving text messages between the couple showed James was a caring, attentive husband. The trial began in July of 2025, more than 2 years after Angela's death. For 3 weeks, prosecutors methodically laid out their case, calling witnesses who testified about James's suspicious behavior and his secret life. Karen Kane took the stand, describing how James had deceived her about his marital status. She testified that they had exchanged thousands of messages, and that James had professed to love her deeply just days into their relationship. She maintained that she had no knowledge of James's plans, and that her heart was broken for Angela and her family. Another woman, Carrie Hageseth, testified that she had met James on the dating website, and that their relationship had been transactional, with him paying her daughter's car bills. The testimony painted a picture of a man living a secret life, deceiving multiple women while maintaining the facade of a devoted family man. Throughout the trial, prosecutors emphasized that while Angela was crashing in the hospital on March 15th, James had been sitting outside her room taking pictures and texting one of his romantic partners. On July 30th, 2025, after deliberating on the evidence presented over 3 weeks of testimony, the jury returned their verdict. They found James Craig guilty of first-degree murder and 5 other charges related to the poisoning death of his wife. The conviction meant he would face life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, Angela's family members wept, finally seeing justice for the woman they had lost. James Craig was immediately sentenced to life imprisonment. The man who had once been known as a respected dentist and family man would spend the rest of his days behind bars for methodically poisoning his wife of 23 years. The children he and Angela had raised together, 3 of whom were living with James's brother while the other 3 had reached adulthood, would have to find a way forward without either parent. In the aftermath of the trial, one of the Craig daughters, Mira, expressed the ongoing pain of their loss in a social media post. "As of tomorrow, my mom will be 2 months gone," she wrote on Mother's Day 2023. "I haven't the words to express the heartache my siblings and I feel every day." She ended with a simple message of love. "I love you so much, Mama, we miss you." Angela Craig had been the youngest of 10 children, the one who jokingly claimed to be the favorite. She had married James on December 18, 1999, and had spent 23 years building a life with him. She had brought 6 children into the world, and had been an engaged, active presence in both her family and her husband's business. Those who knew her remembered her wit, her humor, her dedication to her family, and her capacity for forgiveness. The case sent shockwaves through the Aurora community and captured national attention. People struggled to reconcile the image of the friendly dentist who had treated their teeth and chatted about his family with the cold reality of what he had done. Stephen Tubbs, a local podcaster who had once been James Craig's patient and had worked with the Craigs on advertising for their dental practice, created a podcast series about the case. In nearly 34 years of being a newsman, Tubbs said, "The most unbelievable and seemingly thorough arrest affidavit I have ever read." The investigation also revealed additional disturbing details. While in jail awaiting trial, James Craig allegedly attempted to orchestrate a scheme to produce false witnesses who would testify that Angela had wanted to frame him and had accidentally taken her plan too far. He faced additional charges of solicitation to commit first-degree murder, solicitation to tamper with physical evidence, and solicitation to commit perjury. These charges suggested that even after his arrest, James continued to try to manipulate the situation to his advantage. Medical toxicology experts who reviewed the case emphasized an important message about poison as a murder weapon. Despite its reputation as the tool for a perfect crime, modern forensic science has become highly sophisticated at detecting toxic substances. "You're going to get caught," Dr. Jeff LaPointe, director of medical toxicology at San Diego's Kaiser Permanente Hospital, told investigators. The case proved his point, as the combination of Angela's autopsy results, the digital trail of James's research and purchases, and the testimony of witnesses all converged to reveal the truth. The trial also highlighted the role that Ryan Redfern played in bringing the truth to light. His decision to alert hospital staff about the cyanide, despite decades of friendship with James, may have been crucial to the investigation. His willingness to cooperate with police, even after James pleaded with him not to, demonstrated the moral courage required to expose someone you thought you knew. For Angela's family, the conviction brought a measure of closure, though the loss of a beloved sister, aunt, and mother could never truly be repaired. During the trial, family members testified about James's odd behavior during Angela's hospitalizations, painting a picture of a man who seemed disconnected from the tragedy unfolding around him. Their testimony helped the jury understand the human cost of James's actions, the way his choices had destroyed not just Angela's life, but the lives of everyone who loved her. The case stands as a stark reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. James Craig had been a dentist, a father, a husband, a member of his church community. He had treated patients with skill and run a business with his wife by his side. But beneath that respectable exterior, he had harbored the capacity to commit an act of almost unimaginable cruelty. Over the course of more than a week, he had watched Angela suffer through symptoms that baffled medical professionals, knowing all the while that he was the cause of her agony. Angela Craig's story is ultimately one of betrayal by the person who should have protected her most. She had trusted her husband with her life, literally drinking the protein shakes he prepared for her each morning. She had texted him loving messages even as the poison he had given her coursed through her body. She had believed in the marriage they had built together, the family they had created, the future they had planned. And he had systematically taken all of that away from her, day by poisoned day, until there was nothing left but silence. The 6 children Angela left behind now faced the rest of their lives, carrying the weight of what happened to their mother and what their father did. They lost not only a parent who loved them, but also their sense of safety and trust in the world. The case serves as a somber testament to the devastating ripple effects of violence within families, and to the courage of those like Ryan Redfern, who choose truth over loyalty when confronted with evil. Angela Craig died on March 18, 2023, but her memory lives on in the children she raised, the family who loved her, and in the pursuit of justice that ensured her killer would answer for his crimes. Her case reminds us that even in the darkest moments, when doctors are baffled and answers seem impossible to find, the truth has a way of emerging into the light. And it stands as a warning that no matter how clever someone believes they are, no matter how carefully they plan, murder will not go unpunished. Story 2. The desert night in the Catalina foothills settles with a darkness so complete that even the stars seem impossibly bright against the velvet sky. The winding roads that snake through this affluent community north of Tucson, Arizona, are lined with prickly cacti and sprawling estates, each property tucked away behind desert foliage on lots spanning an acre or more. It is the kind of place where people move to find peace, to escape the noise of city life, to wake up to mountain vistas and the silent beauty of the Sonoran Desert. For Nancy Guthrie, it had been home for more than 5 decades. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, Nancy was doing what she had done countless times before, spending a Saturday with family. At 84 years old, she maintained her independence fiercely, living alone in her Catalina foothills home despite limited mobility that required the aid of a pacemaker and daily medication. Her mind remained sharp, her spirit undimmed by the years or the tragedies she had endured. Those who knew her described a woman of integrity and loyalty, someone who spoke the truth even when it was uncomfortable, who lived boldly and adventurously. Nancy had taken an Uber at 5:32 that evening to her daughter Annie's home for dinner and games. Annie lived nearby with her husband, Tommaso Cioni, and the family gathering was the kind of ordinary, precious evening that forms the fabric of a life well lived. They shared a meal, played games, talked and laughed in the comfortable way that families do. When the evening drew to a close, Tommaso offered to drive Nancy home, as he had done many times before. At 9:48 that night, Tommaso's vehicle pulled into Nancy's driveway. The garage door closed at 9:50, and Tommaso drove away, the last person known to have seen Nancy Guthrie. In the profound darkness that characterizes the Catalina foothills after nightfall, Nancy entered her home alone. The neighborhood around her was silent, the houses spaced so far apart that screams might go unheard, the absence of streetlights creating a darkness that stargazers loved, but that could cloak malicious intent. What happened in the hours that followed would transform a peaceful Saturday into a nightmare that would capture national attention and leave a family shattered with fear and uncertainty. To understand the weight of what was lost that night, one must first understand who Nancy Guthrie was. Born Nancy Ellen Long on January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky, she grew up just 5 miles from downtown Cincinnati. She attended Notre Dame Academy in Park Hills, Kentucky, and later went on to the University of Kentucky, where in 1963 she served as a staff member and society editor for the university's student newspaper, the Kentucky Colonel. It was at a UK basketball game during a blind date that Nancy met Charles Guthrie, a mining engineer. According to family lore, when Nancy first saw Charles at the door of her sorority house, she knew instantly that he was the man she would marry. They built a life together, a family that would eventually include 3 children, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron. Charles's work took them around the world before they settled in Arizona in the early 1970s, drawn by the same desert beauty and tranquility that would define Nancy's life for more than 50 years. But Nancy's life was not without profound sorrow. In June of 1988, when she was just 46 years old and Savannah was 16, Charles died suddenly of a heart attack while on a mining exploration project in Mexico. At 49 years old, he was gone, leaving Nancy to raise 3 children alone. She did so with the same resilience that would define the rest of her life, never succumbing to self-pity, always driven by determination and an unwavering faith. By 2026, Nancy had become a beloved fixture in her community. She was a regular churchgoer, mentally sharp, and fiercely independent despite her physical limitations. Her daughter Savannah had become a co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, a journalist known to millions of Americans. But to Nancy, Savannah was simply her daughter, the girl with the round cheeks, curly hair, and blue eyes that ran in the family. The timeline that would later emerge from law enforcement painted a chilling picture of the hours between Saturday night and Sunday morning. At 1:47 in the morning, Nancy's doorbell camera disconnected from her home security system. 25 minutes later, at 2:12, motion detection software registered movement on one of Nancy's other cameras, but no video was captured because the service subscription had lapsed. At 2:28 in the morning, Nancy's pacemaker app disconnected from her phone. For a woman who relied on daily medication and lived with cardiac issues and high blood pressure, this detail was particularly ominous. As dawn broke over the Catalina foothills on Sunday, February 1st, the Santa Catalina Mountains glowed in the early morning light. Nancy should have been preparing for church, as she did every Sunday, but the pew where she usually sat remained empty. Around 11 in the morning, a concerned member of Nancy's church called her family to report that she had not appeared for the service as expected. For a woman as regular in her habits and as mentally sharp as Nancy, this absence was immediately alarming. Family members rushed to her home, arriving at 11:56. They searched the house and surrounding property, calling her name, looking for any sign of where she might have gone. What they found instead stopped them cold. Nancy's personal belongings, including her phone and other essential items, were still inside the home. For a woman who could not walk 50 yards by herself, who required daily medication and had a pacemaker, the idea that she had left voluntarily was impossible to believe. At 12:03 that afternoon, the family called 911. 12 minutes later, deputies from the Pima County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene that would soon be declared a crime scene. What law enforcement discovered at Nancy Guthrie's home was deeply disturbing. Near the entrance of the house, investigators found bloodstains. Video footage captured by media outlets would later show what appeared to be a trail of blood near the front door. Forensic testing would confirm that the DNA collected at the scene belonged to Nancy Guthrie. The doorbell security camera had been physically removed from its mount. Whoever had been at Nancy's home in those dark early morning hours had known about the camera and had taken deliberate steps to disable it. Personal items that Nancy would never have left behind voluntarily were still in the house. Sheriff Chris Nanos, who responded to the scene, would later describe what he saw in stark terms. At this point, investigators believed she was taken from her home against her will, possibly in the middle of the night, he stated. The evidence, he said, indicated that a crime had taken place within the house. Conditions inside the home were very concerning and inconsistent with a voluntary disappearance. The investigation immediately escalated beyond a routine missing person case. Homicide detectives from the Criminal Investigations Division were brought in. The home was processed as a crime scene, with forensic teams combing through every inch for evidence. Search and rescue teams were deployed, including canine units, drones, and aerial resources, with assistance from U.S. Customs and Border Protection. But the same features that made the Catalina foothills so peaceful also made the investigation incredibly challenging. The darkness that descended each night was profound, the kind of darkness that could hide almost anything. The properties were spaced so far apart, tucked behind desert vegetation, that neighbors' security cameras often captured only their immediate vicinity. The roads were winding and remote, offering countless routes in and out of the area. Despite the extensive search efforts, no trace of Nancy Guthrie was found. No footprints, no tire tracks, no witnesses who had seen or heard anything unusual in the night. It was as if she had simply vanished into the desert darkness. By February 2nd, the Pima County Sheriff's Department officially announced that the case had shifted from a search operation to a criminal investigation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation joined the effort, bringing additional resources and expertise to a case that was becoming more troubling by the hour. Authorities described Nancy as a vulnerable adult due to her age, mobility limitations, and reliance on daily medication, while noting that she had no known cognitive impairments. Sheriff Nanos held a press conference, addressing the media from outside Nancy's home as helicopters flew overhead. "Right now, we don't view this as a rescue mission as much as we view it as a crime scene," he told reporters. The message was clear. Law enforcement believed something terrible had happened to Nancy Guthrie, and they were treating her disappearance as a potential abduction or worse. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage from neighborhood camera systems and canvassed nearby residences. They analyzed digital evidence, forensic materials, and any leads that came in from the public. The White House posted information about Nancy on its social media accounts, urging anyone with relevant information to come forward. But as the days passed with no sign of Nancy, the investigation would take an even more disturbing turn. On February 2nd, just one day after Nancy's disappearance, a media agency in Tucson reported that it had received a letter demanding payment for Nancy's release. The note contained specific details about Nancy's home and what she was wearing the night she disappeared, information that made investigators take it seriously. Authorities reviewed the letter and shared it with the FBI, though they declined to confirm whether it was sent by someone actually holding Nancy. The following day, it reported that it had received an alleged ransom note demanding millions of dollars in Bitcoin, including a specific cryptocurrency address and a deadline. On February 5th, Harvey Levin, founder of TMZ, claimed to have received another ransom note stating, "You will have no way of contacting me," and later a letter indicating that Nancy was still alive but scared and aware of the demands being made. The note claimed it would be their only communication. The ransom notes presented investigators with a terrible dilemma. Were they genuine communications from whoever had taken Nancy, or were they cruel hoaxes designed to exploit a family's anguish? The Pima County Sheriff's Department acknowledged awareness of the reports and stated that all tips and materials were being forwarded to detectives working with the FBI. The uncertainty was compounded when, on February 5th, a California man was arrested on federal charges alleging that he had posed as an abductor and demanded ransom from the Guthrie family. Authorities stated that this scheme was unrelated to the other ransom demands that had received widespread publicity. The arrest revealed the dark reality that even in the midst of genuine tragedy, there were those willing to prey on a family's desperation. But other ransom communications continued to be investigated as potentially legitimate. On February 7th, it was reported that one ransom demand was for $6 million in Bitcoin, with a deadline of 5 p.m. on February 9th. The demand threatened Nancy's life if the deadline was not met. As the investigation unfolded, Savannah Guthrie stepped away from her NBC duties, including plans to co-host the opening ceremonies of the 2026 Winter Olympics. She returned to Arizona to be with her family and to assist in the search for her mother. The woman millions of Americans saw on their television screens each morning was now living every family's worst nightmare. On February 4th, Savannah appeared in a video statement alongside her siblings, Annie and Cameron. Her face was drawn with exhaustion and fear, her usual composure fractured by the unimaginable stress of the situation. The family was aware of reports concerning ransom letters, she said, and they directed their remarks to whoever was responsible for their mother's disappearance. "We are ready to talk," Savannah said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. But given how easily voices and images could be manipulated in the modern age, the family needed confirmation that Nancy was alive and being held. "We want to hear from you, and we are ready to listen," she pleaded. "Please reach out to us." 3 days later, on February 7th, the family released another video that appeared to address those potentially connected to their mother's disappearance. This time, Savannah's message was more direct, more desperate. "We received your message and we understand," she said. "We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her. This is the only way we will have peace." Then came the words that would resonate with anyone who had ever loved someone. "This is very valuable to us, and we will pay." It was a daughter's raw plea, stripped of pride or pretense, offering anything, everything, for the chance to see her mother alive again. The woman who interviewed presidents and covered Olympic Games was reduced to begging unknown individuals for mercy, offering millions of dollars for something that should never have been taken in the first place. As the investigation stretched into its second week, questions began to emerge about the handling of the case in its crucial early hours. On February 5th, Sheriff Nanos acknowledged that missteps had been made. The sheriff's department had removed crime scene tape and released Nancy's home too soon, only to return days later to recover additional evidence. In hindsight, Nanos admitted, the scene should have remained secured longer, and other agencies could have been called in earlier. Nanos explained that investigators believed they had completed processing the scene at the time, but later determined that conclusion was premature. It was an admission that in a case where every moment mattered, where an 84-year-old woman with serious health conditions was missing and possibly injured, valuable time and potential evidence may have been lost. On the evening of February 7th, law enforcement conducted a search of the home of Annie and Tommaso Cioni. The fact that investigators were examining the home of Nancy's daughter and son-in-law, the last known person to see her, added another layer of complexity and pain to an already agonizing situation. No arrests were announced, no suspects publicly named, but the search underscored that investigators were exploring every possible avenue, including those closest to Nancy. In the Catalina foothills, the community that had prized its peace and safety was grappling with a new and unwelcome reality. Jeff Lamy, Nancy's neighbor, described the atmosphere. People feel uneasy, I wouldn't say fearful, but this situation is obviously shocking. The area was known for outdoor recreational opportunities, not for crime scene investigations and reports of kidnappings. We've resided here for 6 years. It's truly a fantastic neighborhood, Lamy told reporters. But now that sense of security had been shattered. The darkness that descended each night, once appreciated for its stargazing opportunities, now seemed menacing. The isolation that had once felt peaceful now felt vulnerable. Nancy's neighbors gathered among themselves, seeking information and comfort, trying to make sense of something that felt like a horrible invasion of their community. The Catalina Hills area, with its population of around 53,000 and median age of 56, was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where an elderly woman like Nancy could live independently and feel safe. That illusion had been destroyed in a single night. As of February 8, 2026, Nancy Guthrie had not been located. The investigation remained active, with federal and local authorities continuing to pursue leads and solicit information from the public. The FBI had offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to Nancy's safe return. Special Agent Keith Jan of the FBI's Phoenix office made a direct appeal to anyone who might be involved. To those that may be involved, do the right thing. This is an 84-year-old grandma that needs medication for her well-being. You still have time to do the right thing before this gets much worse for you. Please return her home. But as the hours became days and the days stretched toward 2 weeks, the terrible question that hung over everything was whether Nancy Guthrie was even still alive. Law enforcement officials stated plainly that they did not know. The blood found at her home, her disconnected pacemaker app, her need for daily medication, her age and fragile health, all of it pointed to the grim possibility that time might have already run out. The ransom deadline of 5 p.m. on February 9th loomed. Would the family pay? Would whoever sent the demands actually release Nancy if they did? Or were the ransom notes nothing more than cruel hoaxes, designed to profit from a family's agony, while the truth of what happened to Nancy remained hidden somewhere in the vast Arizona desert? Nancy Guthrie's story is one that resonates with a particular kind of horror because it strikes at something fundamental to human experience. The vulnerability we all face in our own homes, in the darkness of night, when we are at our most unguarded. An 84-year-old woman, beloved by her family and community, was apparently taken from her home by force, leaving behind only blood and questions. For Savannah Guthrie and her siblings, the nightmare was compounded by the uncertainty. They did not know if their mother was alive or dead, suffering or beyond suffering. They did not know if the ransom demands were real or false, if paying would save her or merely enrich those who would prey on their desperation. They could only wait, hope, beg, and offer everything they had for the chance to bring their mother home. The investigation continued to unfold, with detectives pursuing leads and analyzing evidence, searching for the truth in security footage and forensic reports and the statements of neighbors who saw and heard nothing unusual that night. Somewhere in that data, in those dark hours between Saturday night and Sunday morning, lay the answer to what happened to Nancy Guthrie. But as of February 8th, that answer remained elusive, hidden in the profound darkness of a Catalina foothills night. Nancy Guthrie had lived a life defined by resilience, by integrity, by the kind of strength that sees a widow through raising 3 children alone after losing her husband at 49. She had been bold and adventurous, ready to travel anywhere, a woman who faced unimaginable challenges with determination and faith. She deserved to spend her twilight years in the peace of the desert home she had loved for 5 decades, surrounded by the family she had raised and the community she had served. Instead, she became the center of a mystery that captured national attention and left those who loved her trapped in an agony of not knowing. As investigators continued their work and the family waited for word, for proof of life, for any sign that might bring Nancy home, the case stood as a stark reminder of how quickly safety can transform into danger, how the ordinary rhythms of family life can be shattered in a single night, and how the search for truth and justice can be hampered by darkness, distance, and the passage of time. The story of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance does not yet have an ending. As of this writing, her fate remains unknown, her whereabouts a mystery, and her family's anguish ongoing. What is known is that on a Saturday night in late January 2026, an 84-year-old woman returned home from dinner with her daughter, and by Sunday morning, she was gone, leaving behind only blood, disabled security cameras, and a family's desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, she might still come home. Story 3. The autumn of 2019 arrived in Columbia, Missouri, painting the university town in shades of amber and crimson as students filled the streets around the University of Missouri campus. Among the thousands of residents going about their daily lives was a 28-year-old woman named Mengqi Ji, a brilliant engineer who had traveled halfway around the world from China to pursue her dreams in America. She had earned her master's degree in mechanical and aerospace engineering from the University of Missouri in December 2014, graduating from one of the most demanding programs the university offered. But by October 2019, her dreams had turned to nightmares, trapped in a marriage that was slowly destroying her from within. Mengqi had been born in China to parents Kurun and Xiaolin Ji, who had raised their daughter with love and high expectations. She attended the prestigious East China University of Science and Technology in Shanghai before making the momentous decision to continue her education in the United States. She arrived in Missouri as a foreign exchange student, eager to immerse herself in American academic life and engineering studies that would open doors to a successful career. It was during her time at the university that she met Joseph Eledge, an American student who seemed charming and attentive at first. They began dating, and eventually their relationship deepened into marriage. Together, they had a daughter, whom they named Anna, born in 2018. From the outside, they appeared to be a young family building a life together in the college town. But behind closed doors in their apartment on Eastwood Drive in Columbia, a different reality was unfolding, one that Mengqi documented in journals and diaries. Joseph Eledge was not the supportive husband he appeared to be. He was controlling, manipulative, and verbally abusive, subjecting Mengqi to constant psychological torment. The abuse was relentless and multifaceted, designed to break down Mengqi's sense of self-worth and autonomy. In one particularly chilling statement captured in audio recordings that Mengqi had secretly made, Joseph told her, "You think you are so empowered because of this society? Well, don't forget that nature," trailing off with an implied threat that sent alarm bells ringing when investigators would later hear it. The recordings Mengqi made went on, documenting Joseph's blatant emotional abuse and attempts to control her. He threatened to physically kick Mengqi's mother if she ever stepped foot in their house again. He threatened to have Mengqi deported back to China, wielding his American citizenship like a weapon over his foreign-born wife. He accused Mengqi of abusing him, gaslighting her so thoroughly that at one point she could be heard on the recording saying, "You are brainwashing me." She knew she was trapped, aware of the psychological manipulation but seemingly powerless to escape it. The abuse extended beyond Mengqi. In February 2019, Mengchi discovered purple and yellow bruises on their infant daughter Anna's rear end. The discovery horrified her. She confided in a friend via email, expressing her suspicion that Joseph was abusing their baby daughter. Mengchi told the friend she was going to call the police, but then changed her mind and decided to give her husband one more chance after he promised he would never do it again. She photographed the bruises on her iPad, documenting the evidence even as she chose to believe his promises. It was a decision born of desperation, fear, and the complex dynamics of domestic abuse that keep victims tethered to their abusers even when logic screams at them to run. By October 2019, Mengchi had reached her breaking point. She could no longer live in this toxic environment, could no longer subject herself and her daughter to Joseph's cruelty. She reached out to her ex-boyfriend about finding a divorce attorney. She was making plans, gathering evidence of the abuse, preparing to take Anna and return to China where her parents could help her rebuild her life. She maintained daily phone conversations with her mother in China, staying connected across the thousands of miles that separated them. These daily calls were her lifeline, a reminder that she had family who loved her, people who would support her escape from this nightmare marriage. Then on October 8, 2019, those daily phone calls stopped. Mengchi's mother tried calling her daughter the next day, and the day after that, but received no response. The silence was deafening and terrifying. Something was wrong. Mengchi never missed their daily conversations. In Columbia, Missouri, the apartment on Eastwood Drive was the site of events that would not come to light for days, then months, then over a year. According to Joseph Eledge's later testimony, the night of October 8, 2019, began ordinarily enough. He claimed he gave Mengchi a massage and tried to initiate intimacy, but when he attempted to undress her, she stopped him. She told him she was meeting with someone the next morning, he said. That was when Joseph claimed he confronted her about messages he had found on her devices, messages she had been sending to another man. An argument ensued, though the details of what actually happened that night would remain murky, filtered through Joseph's self-serving accounts that would change repeatedly depending on his legal strategy. What is clear is that when the sun rose on October 9, 2019, Mengchi Ji was no longer alive. Joseph discovered that Mengchi was missing at 5 o'clock that morning, but he did not tell anyone she was gone. Not that morning, not that afternoon, not that evening. Hours ticked by while Mengchi's mother called from China, her phone ringing unanswered in an apartment where her daughter lay dead. Joseph waited more than 30 hours before reporting his wife missing. It was not until a friend of Mengchi's came to their apartment at 9 o'clock in the morning on October 10, 2019, that anyone was told Mengchi was gone. When Joseph finally reported Mengchi missing, his story was that he had woken up and found her gone. She had left without taking her car, without taking her purse, without taking her house keys. She had simply vanished into the Missouri autumn, he claimed, leaving behind her infant daughter and all her possessions. Columbia Police Department immediately launched an investigation into her disappearance. Assistant Chief Jeremiah Hunter and his team began the painstaking work of searching for the missing young mother. From the beginning, Joseph Eledge was their prime suspect. We keyed on some of the things he had told us throughout the investigations, statements that he had made, that just weren't adding up, Hunter later explained. One particularly telling detail caught the investigators' attention. Joseph spoke about Mengchi in the past tense during media interviews, a significant red flag that suggested he knew she was already dead. When police searched the couple's apartment, they discovered Mengchi's iPad, which contained the photographs she had taken of bruises on their daughter Anna. The images were damning evidence of child abuse. On October 25, 2019, just 2 weeks after Mengchi's disappearance was reported, Joseph Eledge was arrested on child abuse charges. While Joseph sat in jail on the child abuse charges, investigators continued searching for Mengchi's body. They examined Joseph's cell phone records and discovered something he had not told them. On October 9, 2019, the day he claimed to have discovered Mengchi missing, he had spent 30 minutes near the Lamine River in Cooper County, about 35 miles west of Colombia. This was during the hours when he should have been panicking about his missing wife, calling hospitals and friends, searching desperately for her. Instead, he had driven to a remote area by a river and spent half an hour there, then never mentioned it to police. Convinced Mengqi's body was at the Lamine River location, authorities launched extensive searches that lasted for months. They combed through the area near Highway 41, deploying search teams and resources in an intensive effort to find the young mother's remains. A memorial was even held on the river, attended by Mengqi's mother, who had flown from China to be present as the investigation unfolded. But despite all their efforts, they found nothing. The river kept its secrets, or perhaps it held no secrets at all. Investigators were not naive enough to believe the river was the only possibility, but Joseph's cell phone data had pointed them there, and they had followed the lead as far as they could. On February 20th, 2020, Joseph Edge was formally charged with first-degree murder in Mengqi's disappearance, despite the absence of a body. The evidence against him was circumstantial but compelling. His changing stories, his suspicious behavior, the cell phone data placing him at the Lamine River, the documented history of abuse, and the fact that Mengqi had been preparing to divorce him and take their daughter back to China. Joseph's defense attorney, Scott Rosenblum, would later claim in court that Mengqi might have run away with a man she was having a romantic relationship with. But this theory failed to explain why she would leave her infant daughter behind, or why she would never contact her mother in China. Months turned into a year, then more than a year. Mengqi's parents fought for custody of their granddaughter, battling against Joseph's mother Jean Edge, who had filed for guardianship. The legal battle was agonizing for Ku Run and Xiaolin Ji, who believed their granddaughter should be with them, that this was what their daughter would have wanted. Eventually, they reached an agreement. Anna would spend summers in China with Mengqi's parents and the rest of the year with Joseph's mother in the United States. It was a compromise born of tragedy, a shared custody arrangement with the ghost of the murdered mother hovering over every decision. Then, on March 25, 2021, more than 17 months after Mengqi's disappearance, a hiker was walking through Rock Bridge Memorial State Park in Colombia when they stumbled upon something that made them stop in horror. Partially concealed beneath the earth and leaves were skeletal remains. Near the remains, the hiker found personal property that resembled items belonging to Mengqi Ji. The hiker immediately contacted authorities, and police descended on the remote wooded area of the park. On April 6, 2021, Columbia Mayor Brian Treese announced that an odontologist working at the request of the Boone County Medical Examiner had compared dental records obtained by the police department to the dental remains found at the park. They were a match. The remains were confirmed to be those of Mengqi Ji. Police Chief Jeff Jones expressed his gratitude for the courage of the hikers who had made the discovery. Assistant Chief Jeremiah Hunter noted that the remains did not immediately reveal how Mengqi had died because of their decomposed state. The cause and manner of death would require further investigation. The location where Mengqi's remains were found was significant for two reasons. First, it was 35 miles away from the Lamine River area where police had spent months searching, explaining why those intensive efforts had yielded nothing. Second, and far more important for the prosecution's case, Mengqi's shallow grave was located directly beneath a juniper tree. When police had searched Joseph and Mengqi's apartment in the early days of the investigation, they had found a pair of muddy boots belonging to Joseph. At the time, the boots were simply collected as potential evidence, but their true significance would not become clear until Mengqi's body was discovered. Forensic experts examined the boots and found several juniper tree needles stuck to the soles. They then collected samples from the juniper tree that stood directly above Mengqi's burial site. DNA analysis revealed an exact match between the needles on Joseph's boots and the tree under which his wife was buried. It was an extraordinary piece of forensic evidence, the kind that seems almost too perfect, as if nature itself was determined to ensure justice for Mengqi. The DNA evidence from the tree, combined with the cell phone records, the documented abuse, the lies Joseph had told, and the timeline of events, created an overwhelming circumstantial case against him. The trial began in November 2021, nearly 2 years after Mengqi's death. Prosecutor Dan Knight faced a significant challenge. Because of the decomposed state of Mengqi's remains, medical examiners were unable to provide a definitive cause of death. The prosecution noted that a neck bone was missing from Mengqi's remains and theorized that Joseph had strangled her, but they could not prove it conclusively. Joseph L.Edge's defense strategy underwent several transformations. On the first day of trial, in a stunning admission, Joseph acknowledged that he had killed Mengqi, but claimed it was an accident. According to his testimony, after the argument about the messages to another man, he pushed Mengqi and she hit her head, suffering a subdural hematoma in her sleep. He claimed that when he woke at 5 in the morning and heard his baby crying, he found his wife dead. His attorney Scott Rosenblum told the jury that Joseph was in a dissociated state of denial and panicked. Instead of calling 911, Joseph decided to bury his wife's body. Once he went down that rabbit hole, he chose to continue down that path, Rosenblum said about his client's subsequent lies to Columbia police. The jury heard hours of audio recordings documenting Joseph's verbal abuse of Mengqi. They heard him threaten her, gaslight her, and attempt to control every aspect of her life. They learned about the bruises on baby Anna and Mengqi's suspicions that Joseph was abusing their daughter. They heard testimony from Yao Li, who had translated Mengqi's journals for the prosecutor's office. Through Yao Li's translations, the jury understood that things in the L.Edge household had not gotten better, despite Joseph's promises, and that Mengqi had felt unable to walk away despite the abuse. When Joseph took the witness stand, Prosecutor Dan Knight questioned him for nearly 3 hours, trying to pinpoint how Mengqi had actually died. "You killed Mengqi on that bed, didn't you?" Knight demanded. "No," Joseph replied. Knight asked if he had stood on top of her back and jumped on her. "No," Joseph said. Knight asked if he had suffocated her. Again, Joseph answered no. He insisted repeatedly that Mengqi's death was an accident, that he had pushed her, that she had hit her head, that he found her dead hours later. The jury did not fully believe him. After nearly 2 weeks of testimony detailing the audio recordings, digital evidence, cell tower data, and the tree DNA linking Joseph to Mengqi's burial site, both sides delivered their closing arguments. Rosenblum asked for a verdict of manslaughter, while Knight argued for first-degree murder. On November 12, 2021, the jury reached their decision. They found Joseph Dwayne L.Edge guilty of second-degree murder. The verdict meant the jury believed Joseph had killed Mengqi intentionally, but not with premeditation. They accepted that while he was a murderer, he had not necessarily planned to kill his wife days or weeks in advance. The jury recommended a sentence of 28 years in prison for the murder conviction. Joseph also pleaded guilty to child abuse, child endangerment, and domestic assault in February 2022, receiving additional sentences for those crimes. Yao Li said that Mengqi's parents were very pleased with the guilty verdict, though no verdict could bring their daughter back or undo the years of abuse she had suffered. In September 2022, Joseph L.Edge filed a 67-page appeal arguing there was not enough evidence to convict him. The appeal claimed the state had failed to prove the cause or manner of Mengqi's death, and had failed to prove Joseph killed her with deliberation or in sudden passion. It acknowledged that Joseph had lied about knowing Mengqi was dead and how she died, but argued this did not prove he planned to kill her. The Attorney General's office, which handles such appeals, declined to comment, but the conviction was ultimately upheld. The story of Mengqi Ji is a tragedy that unfolds across continents and cultures, but at its heart it is a universal tale of domestic violence and the deadly consequences when victims attempt to escape. Mengqi had traveled 8,000 miles from China to America, earned an advanced engineering degree from a prestigious university, and was raising a daughter she loved. She had so much to live for, so many reasons to escape her abusive marriage. She reached out for help, gathered evidence, made plans to divorce, and return to China with her daughter. She did everything that domestic violence advocates tell victims to do. And still she died. Her parents, Kurun and Xiaolan Ji, lost their daughter to violence in a foreign country, forced to navigate an unfamiliar legal system in a language not their own, fighting for custody of a granddaughter who would grow up knowing her mother was murdered by her father. Their daily phone conversations with Mengqi, which had been a constant connection across the vast distance separating them, ended abruptly on October 8, 2019, replaced by an agonizing silence that lasted more than 17 months until a hiker stumbled upon their daughter's remains beneath a juniper tree in a Missouri park. The case was solved through a combination of traditional detective work and cutting-edge forensic science. The audio recordings Mengqi had secretly made documented her husband's abuse and gave voice to her suffering even after death. The cell phone records contradicted Joseph's lies and pointed investigators in the right direction. The photographs on her iPad revealed that the abuse extended to their infant daughter. And ultimately, the DNA from juniper tree needles on a pair of muddy boots provided the physical evidence linking Joseph Eledge to the burial site where he had hidden his wife's body, thinking it would never be found. Mengqi Ji deserved so much better than the life she endured and the death she suffered. She deserved to raise her daughter in safety, to use her engineering degree to build a career, to find happiness and peace. Instead, she documented her abuse in journals and secret recordings, discovered bruises on her baby, and was murdered when she finally found the courage to leave. Her story stands as a painful reminder that leaving an abusive relationship is often the most dangerous moment, and that domestic violence knows no boundaries of culture, education, or geography. A brilliant engineer with a master's degree from an American university was just as vulnerable to abuse as anyone else, just as trapped by fear and manipulation, and just as dead when her husband decided she would not be allowed to escape. Rock Bridge Memorial State Park, where hikers once found skeletal remains beneath a juniper tree, continues to welcome visitors who walk its trails unaware of the tragedy that unfolded there. But for those who know the story, the park will forever be marked as the place where Mengqi Ji was finally found, where tree DNA and muddy boots helped bring a measure of justice, and where a young mother's stolen future lies buried beneath Missouri soil, 8,000 miles from the home and parents she would never see again. Story 4. The winter wind swept through the narrow streets of Oostburg, a quiet town nestled in the Dutch province of Zeeland, where cobblestones glistened beneath the December rain and holiday lights cast warm glows from shop windows. In one such shop along Burgemeester Erasmusstraat, a young woman pursued her passion with needle and thread, transforming fabric into dreams. Michelle van de Velde, at 29 years old, had built something precious, a tailoring boutique called Pins and Needles, situated in the very heart of the town center. It was her pride, a manifestation of years of determination and creativity. But on December 15, 2020, the threads of her life would be violently severed in a tragedy born from jealousy, betrayal, and a love triangle that spiraled into darkness. Born on July 21, 1991, in the Zeeland town of Terneuzen, Michelle grew up in Nieuwliet on a camping ground managed by her parents, Rob and Miranda. She spent her childhood surrounded by the rhythms of family life alongside her younger brother Jeffrey, who was 2 years her junior. Those who knew Michelle described her as a cheerful entrepreneur with an infectious energy that brightened any room she entered. Her ambition carried her through the years, and eventually, she established her own tailoring business in Oostburg, where she became known for her skill and dedication to her craft. The shop stood as a testament to her independence and her vision for the future. Inside its walls, she spent countless hours measuring, cutting, and stitching, building not just garments but relationships with her customers and the community. Her family remained close, particularly her grandmother, who saw her on December 14th, just one day before Michelle would vanish from their lives forever. That evening encounter would become the last confirmed sighting by someone who truly knew her, a moment frozen in time before everything changed. Just down the same street where Michelle operated Pins and Needles, another shop stood with an entirely different atmosphere. This was a spiritual store owned by Sandra H., a 46-year-old woman from Ardenburg who sold crystals, incense, and items meant to bring peace and enlightenment. The irony of what would transpire within those walls would not be lost on anyone who later learned the truth. Sandra and Ischel knew each other through the proximity of their businesses, but their connection deepened in ways that would prove fatal. Sandra was married, though her relationship had grown complicated. At some point, a triad relationship developed involving Sandra, her husband, and Ischel. It was an arrangement that, however it began, created a volatile emotional landscape. Sandra's husband and Ischel fell deeply in love during this brief arrangement, and Sandra found herself watching from the sidelines, consumed by feelings of betrayal and rage. The prosecution would later describe how Sandra felt cheated as she witnessed the affection between her husband and the younger woman. Her phone told its own story. She had saved Ischel's name with a derogatory term, a digital record of her growing contempt. On the morning of December 15th, Sandra allegedly read WhatsApp messages exchanged between Ischel and her husband. The words on that screen ignited something dark within her. The prosecutor would later characterize her thought process in chilling terms. "If I can't get Ischel, then neither can you." That day, Ischel made what would be her final visit to Sandra's spiritual shop. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon on December 15th, Ischel was photographed inside the kitchen area of Sandra's spiritual store. This photograph would later become crucial evidence, exposing Sandra's lies about when she had last seen Ischel. What transpired in those rooms remains partially shrouded in conflicting accounts, but the outcome was unambiguous. Ischel van de Velde would never leave that shop alive. Sandra would eventually claim that Ischel's death was an accident, a tragic result of a conversation that spiraled out of control. According to her version, she wanted to warn Ischel about her husband, to prevent the younger woman from falling into the same trap of an unwanted pregnancy that Sandra herself had experienced. She described a physical altercation in the kitchen, pushing and pulling that supposedly ended with Ischel striking her head on the pointed edge of a radiator and losing consciousness. Then, Sandra claimed, panic overtook her, and she gently closed Ischel's throat. But investigators and prosecutors saw through this narrative. The physical evidence didn't support Sandra's story. How could a woman weighing just 60 kilograms, suffering from a neck hernia and a broken little finger, overpower someone as tall and heavy as Ischel, who stood 6 feet tall and weighed 80 kilograms? The prosecutor's reconstruction painted a far more sinister picture. Sandra struck Ischel with a blunt object on her head, specifically targeting her right eye, rendering the taller woman defenseless. With Ischel incapacitated, Sandra allegedly bound her to a chair with a cloth. In the hours that followed, Sandra strangled Ischel to death. The distinction was critical. If Ischel died from an accidental fall followed by a panicked reaction, it might constitute manslaughter. But the evidence suggested premeditation, calculation, and deliberate violence, the hallmarks of murder. When Ischel failed to return home on December 16th, her family immediately sensed something was terribly wrong. This was not like her. Ischel was responsible, connected to her loved ones, and she would never simply disappear without explanation. Yet despite the family's urgent concerns, the police response was troublingly slow. Ischel wasn't officially entered into all police systems until December 23rd, a full week after her disappearance. Forensic investigations of her shop and home didn't begin until January 18th, 2021, more than a month after she vanished. The family refused to wait. They organized their own search efforts, distributing flyers, coordinating volunteers, and combing through the town and surrounding natural areas looking for any trace of Ischel. On January 5th, 2021, Ischel's mother and brother visited Sandra's spiritual shop as part of their desperate search, asking if anyone had seen their daughter and sister. They stood mere feet from where Ischel's body lay hidden, completely intact inside the shop's fitting room. Sandra had stacked boxes in front of the space and burned copious amounts of incense to mask any telltale odor. She looked Ischel's family in the eyes and lied, offering no hint of the horror concealed behind the wall of boxes. As January turned into February, the search intensified. By then, Ishel had been missing for nearly 2 months. Volunteers, friends, and family continued scouring the countryside, holding on to hope even as that hope grew thinner with each passing day. On February 9, 2021, that hope was finally shattered. Police divers descended into a drainage canal in the rural area near retrenchment in Vol200. What they found in those dark waters transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a murder inquiry. Plastic garbage bags emerged from the canal containing human remains that had been methodically dismembered. On February 16th, authorities confirmed the discovery of a body during the search, and though formal identification was pending, police indicated they believed it was Ishel. Her family received the devastating news that their worst fears had been realized. The recovery process continued for days. On February 27th, search teams from Stichting Signy Zoekhonden, a foundation specializing in search dogs, located the final missing body parts. The complete picture of what had happened to Ishel began to emerge, and it was more horrific than anyone could have imagined. Sandra had hidden Ishel's complete body in her shop for weeks while the search unfolded around her. But eventually, she realized she couldn't move the body intact. Ishel was simply too heavy for Sandra to lift on her own. So Sandra went to a hardware store and purchased a hand axe and a saw. She also bought an air freshener, which investigators later spotted hanging from her rearview mirror on NPR camera footage. Then, in her spiritual shop surrounded by symbols of peace and healing, Sandra dismembered Ishel's body. She placed the parts into garbage bags and drove them around in her vehicle for an extended period, the air freshener attempting to mask the smell of death. Some bags she disposed of in the canal where divers would eventually find them. Other portions of Ishel's remains, Sandra stored in a garage. The prosecutor would later describe Sandra's actions as inhumane and disgusting. Perhaps the most disturbing detail emerged regarding Sandra's 13-year-old son. The boy later told investigators that his mother had asked him to help carry a package wrapped in garbage bags from the spiritual shop to her car. He recalled that it smelled terrible. He even enlisted a friend to help with the heavy lifting. Neither child knew they were handling human remains. Sandra had manipulated her own son into becoming an unwitting participant in disposing of Ishel's body. On February 9, 2021, the same day the search operation intensified, Sandra H. was arrested at her home in Ardenburg as a suspect in Ishel's disappearance. She was the acquaintance who owned the shop on the same street as Ishel's tailoring boutique. Forensic investigators found traces of a crime scene in the spiritual shop, but Sandra immediately began weaving a complex web of denial and misdirection. For months, she maintained that she had nothing to do with Ishel's death. She claimed she had only helped dispose of the body under orders from someone else. Specifically, she tried to implicate her own husband. According to Sandra's false narrative, her husband was responsible for killing Ishel, and she was merely following his instructions to make the body disappear. Investigators thoroughly examined this claim and found absolutely no evidence to support it. On February 16th, during her 5th interrogation, and after being confronted with mounting evidence, Sandra produced a handwritten statement. The prosecutor would later describe this statement as bizarre and completely fabricated. The lies were crumbling, but Sandra continued to avoid the full truth. The psychological burden of maintaining her deception began to take its toll. Her attorney later acknowledged that Sandra suffered mentally from the weight of her lies, and the threshold for telling the truth kept getting higher. Finally, on April 14, 2022, nearly a year and a half after Ishel's disappearance, Sandra confessed. She admitted that she, and she alone, was responsible for Ishel's death. Even then, she clung to the narrative that it had been an accident, that the altercation in the kitchen had simply gone wrong. But her admission at least confirmed what investigators had known. Sandra H. had killed Ishel van de Velde and then systematically destroyed and disposed of her remains. The trial proceedings began in November 2022 at the courthouse in Middelburg. The courtroom became a stage where the prosecution and defense presented vastly different versions of December 15, 2020. Sandra maintained her story about the accidental fall and the panic-driven strangulation. The Public Prosecution Service argued forcefully that the evidence pointed to premeditated murder driven by jealousy and rage. Prosecutor Mark DeGroff, who had led the investigation from the moment Echelle's remains were discovered, presented the case methodically. He pointed out the implausibility of Sandra's version, the evidence of a blunt force trauma to Echelle's head, and the calculated nature of everything that followed. If Sandra had truly panicked, why didn't she call emergency services? Why did she instead suffocate an unconscious woman, hide the body for weeks, purchase dismemberment tools, and manipulate her child into helping dispose of the remains? On November 9, 2022, the prosecution demanded 18 years in prison for murder. Mental health experts advised against institutionalized psychiatric treatment, but they did recommend measures to restrict Sandra's freedom and monitor her behavior if she were ever released, due to concerns about her potential danger. Echelle's parents, Rob and Miranda, attended the proceedings, their pain evident in every moment. They had lost their daughter in the most horrific way imaginable, and then had to endure Sandra's lies and half-truths as their family searched desperately while Echelle's body lay hidden just feet away. The question that haunted them echoed through the courtroom. How could someone take such a beautiful person's life? The court's verdict came with a surprising twist. The judges considered testimony from a woman who claimed to have visited the spiritual shop that fateful morning. Testimony that the prosecutor had deliberately excluded from the evidence because of questions about its reliability. The court used this testimony to sketch a somewhat different scenario of the events. But ultimately, they reached the same conclusion the prosecution had argued. This was murder, not manslaughter. The sentence matched the prosecution's demand, 18 years imprisonment. Sandra H. refused to accept the verdict. She filed an appeal, prolonging the legal proceedings for another year and extending the agony for Echelle's family. The appeal trial began on April 23, 2024, at the Court of Appeal in Den Bosch. Once again, the arguments were presented, the evidence examined, and the competing narratives debated. On May 22, 2024, the appellate court delivered its judgment. The conviction stood. The sentence remained 18 years in prison, with additional restrictions imposed upon Sandra's eventual release due to ongoing concerns about the danger she posed. The court found, as the original trial court had, that Sandra H. had murdered Echelle van de Velde. Still, Sandra persisted. She filed a final appeal to the Hoge Raad, the Supreme Court of the Netherlands. She continued to assert that Echelle's death was an accident and sought to have the conviction reduced to manslaughter. But on February 19, 2025, the Supreme Court issued its ruling. The court declined to hear the case, leaving the appellate court's decision intact. The legal battle that had stretched across more than 4 years finally reached its conclusion. The 18-year sentence for murder was now final and irrevocable. Sandra H. would spend nearly 2 decades behind bars for strangling Echelle van de Velde in a spiritual shop on a December afternoon, and then dismembering her body in an attempt to erase the evidence of her crime. Yet even with the legal proceedings concluded, many questions remained unanswered. The family never received full clarity about exactly what happened in those final hours of Echelle's life. Today, more than 5 years after Echelle disappeared, her family continues to grapple with their loss. The young woman who once filled her tailoring shop with creativity and dreams, who made her parents proud with her entrepreneurial spirit, who laughed with her brother and grandmother. She exists now only in memory and in the hearts of those who loved her. Her shop, Pins and Needles, stands as a reminder of potential unfulfilled, of a life cut devastatingly short. The case exposed not only the darkness that jealousy and possessiveness can breed, but also revealed systemic failures in the initial police response to Echelle's disappearance. The delays in treating her vanishing as a priority cost precious time and may have affected the investigation. Those early missteps became part of the tragedy's painful legacy. Sandra H. remains incarcerated, maintaining to this day that Echelle's death was accidental despite multiple courts rejecting that claim. The evidence, the blunt force trauma, the strangulation, the calculated dismemberment, the manipulation of her own child, paints a portrait of deliberate violence, not tragic accident. In the quiet streets of Oostburg, life goes on. Shops open their doors, customers browse, and the rhythms of daily existence continue. But those who knew Michelle van de Velde carry her absence with them. Her parents lost a daughter. Her brother lost a sister. The community lost a vibrant young entrepreneur whose future held such promise. And in that loss, there remains a stark reminder of how quickly love can twist into obsession, how jealousy can metastasize into violence, and how one person's inability to let go can end another person's everything. The drainage canal in Zuid-Vlaanderen has long since been cleared of its grim contents. The spiritual shop where Michelle drew her last breath has been closed. But the memory of Michelle van de Velde endures, not as a victim defined by how she died, but as a person who lived fully until someone decided she no longer could. Her story serves as both a tragedy and a testament, a reminder that behind every crime statistic lies a human being whose life mattered, whose absence leaves a void that can never truly be filled. Story 5. In the manic, superheated world of professional wrestling, Chris Benoit was a purist's champion. He wasn't a towering giant or a charismatic showman who lived by the microphone. He was a craftsman, a 5'10", 220-pound block of granite whose language was violence, spoken with a technical perfection that bordered on art. Known as the Rabid Wolverine, his intensity was his trademark. He wrestled with a ferocious, almost frightening realism, his body a perpetual motion machine of suplexes, chops, and his signature move, a diving headbutt from the top rope that sent a shockwave through the crowd and, as it would turn out, through the delicate architecture of his own brain. By 2007, the 40-year-old Canadian was a decorated veteran, a former world heavyweight champion who had clawed his way to the pinnacle of a brutal profession. To the millions who watched him on television, he was an icon of grit and determination. To his neighbors in the affluent Atlanta suburb of Fayetteville, he was simply Chris, the quiet family man who lived in a sprawling, two-story house on Green Meadow Lane. It was a picture of suburban tranquility, a meticulously manicured lawn, a 3-car garage, and a swimming pool in the back. Inside lived his wife, Nancy, a striking blonde who had once been part of the wrestling world herself, and their 7-year-old son, Daniel. Daniel was a bright, energetic boy who worshipped his father, a miniature version of the champion, often seen wrestling playfully with him on the living room floor. From the outside, the house was a fortress of success, a monument to the American dream built on a foundation of sweat, sacrifice, and simulated combat. But by June of 2007, the foundation of that fortress was crumbling into dust. The man the world saw in the ring, and the man who walked the halls of 130 Green Meadow Lane were becoming two terrifyingly different people. A darkness had been gathering in Chris Benoit, a perfect storm of physical pain, psychological torment, and a brain that was slowly, silently betraying him. Over the course of one long, humid weekend in late June, that storm would finally break, unleashing a horror that would not only destroy a family, but would send a seismic shock through the entire world of professional wrestling, forcing it to confront the devastating human cost of its spectacle. The weekend began, as it often did, with pain. On the morning of Friday, June 22nd, Chris Benoit visited his personal physician, Dr. Phil Aston, in Carrollton, Georgia. Benoit was a regular visitor, a man whose body was a roadmap of injuries sustained over 2 decades in the ring. His neck, surgically repaired with a metal plate after a career-threatening injury in 2001, was a source of constant agony. He relied on a cocktail of painkillers and other substances to function, to keep the finely tuned machine of his body performing at a world-class level. He was also receiving testosterone injections from Dr. Aston, ostensibly to treat a deficiency, a common consequence of years of steroid abuse. That Friday, he left the doctor's office with another prescription, another temporary fix for a body that was breaking down. He returned home to a house simmering with tension. His marriage to Nancy was in a state of freefall. The couple, who had met and fallen in love amidst the strange, nomadic world of wrestling, were now locked in a cycle of bitter arguments and growing distrust. Just a few days earlier, on June 18th, Nancy had a long, emotional phone call with a friend, Pam Clark. She confided that Chris's mood swings were worsening, that he was becoming increasingly paranoid and volatile. She suspected he was having an affair with another female wrestler, citing his secretive phone calls as evidence. She spoke of his physical abuse, a dark secret she had tried to bring to light years earlier, in 2003, when she filed for divorce and a restraining order, claiming he had threatened her and broken furniture in a rage. She had withdrawn the petition months later, a common pattern in abusive relationships, but the fear had never truly subsided. Now, she told her friend, she was considering taking Daniel and leaving for good. That Friday night, the simmering tension boiled over. The argument, its exact cause lost to the ensuing tragedy, became a physical struggle. In a fit of rage, fueled by a toxic brew of brain damage, drugs, and psychological despair, Chris Benoit attacked his wife. He bound her hands and feet. The struggle was brutal, leaving bruises on her back and stomach as he knelt on her, pressing his knee into her back while he pulled on a cord wrapped around her neck. He asphyxiated her. Nancy Benoit, 43 years old, died on the floor of her own home. Afterward, with a chilling deliberation that defied the notion of a simple, impulsive roid rage, Chris wrapped her body in a blanket and placed a copy of the Bible beside her. The first act of the tragedy was complete. The house fell silent, but the horror was just beginning. Saturday morning dawned, and Chris Benoit moved through the quiet house like a ghost, the body of his dead wife lying in an upstairs room. He was scheduled to appear at a WWE live event in Beaumont, Texas, that evening, but he made no move to leave. Instead, he went about a series of bizarrely mundane tasks. At 8:30 a.m., he called a friend and left a voicemail, inquiring about a horse camp for Daniel, before explaining that his son couldn't attend because he wasn't feeling well. The calm in his voice was unnerving. Sometime that morning, he approached his 7-year-old son. What happened next is a crime almost too monstrous to comprehend. Using Xanax, a powerful anti-anxiety medication that was found in his system, Chris sedated Daniel. As his son lay unconscious in his bed, likely unaware of the fate that awaited him, Chris killed him. He used a chokehold, suffocating the life out of his own child. When police later found Daniel's body, they discovered a butcher knife under the bed, a chilling detail that spoke to the killer's state of mind, though the knife itself had not been used. As he had done with his wife, Chris placed a Bible next to his son's small body. With his entire family dead, Chris spent the rest of the day in the house with the bodies. At 1:57 p.m., he called a newly released wrestler, Michael Parker, and left a rambling, slurred voicemail, talking about office politics as if it were just another day. He was a man adrift, his mind fractured, his actions a grotesque parody of normalcy, set against the backdrop of unimaginable horror. He was now alone in his self-made tomb, a silent, 3-bedroom mausoleum on Green Meadow Lane. Sunday arrived, and with it, the final act. In the pre-dawn hours, between 3:51 and 3:58 a.m., Chris began sending a series of strange, cryptic text messages from both his and Nancy's cell phones to several colleagues, including his close friend, the wrestler Chavo Guerrero Jr. 4 of the messages simply contained his home address. A 5th read, "The dogs are in the enclosed pool area. Garage side door is open." It was a breadcrumb trail, a final, eerie communication designed to ensure their bodies would be found. Chavo, woken by the texts, was confused but went back to sleep, figuring he would ask Chris about them when he picked him up from the airport in Houston later that morning for the Vengeance, Night of Champions pay-per-view event. But Chris never arrived. Late that morning, he called WWE's Talent Relations office with a story about Daniel vomiting and being at the hospital, promising to catch a later flight. It was his last lie. He had no intention of going anywhere. Sometime that evening, Chris Benoit descended into the basement of his home, into his personal weight room. the place where he had sculpted the powerful body that had brought him fame and, ultimately, contributed to his ruin. He took the bar off his lap pull-down machine and fashioned the cable into a noose, the third and final one. Then, he looped the noose around his neck and released the weights. The heavy stack dropped, pulling the cable taut and strangling him. Chris Benoit, the rabid Wolverine, was dead at 40. The first official sign that something was terribly wrong came on Sunday night. Chris was scheduled to face CM Punk for the vacant ECW World Championship, a high-profile match on the Vengeance pay-per-view. When he failed to appear, the company was forced to scramble, substituting him with another wrestler. Backstage, concern was mounting. Chris Benoit did not miss big matches. On Monday, June 25th, after a series of unanswered calls, WWE officials formally requested a welfare check. At around 2:30 p.m., officers from the Fayette County Sheriff's Department arrived at 130 Green Meadow Lane. They found the garage side door open, just as the text message had said. They entered the quiet house. What they discovered inside would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in the history of sports entertainment. They found Nancy's body in an upstairs office, then Daniel's in his bedroom. Finally, they found Chris hanging from his weight machine in the basement. The scene was a quiet tableau of domestic horror. The investigation concluded swiftly. It was a double murder and suicide. That night, WWE was scheduled to air its flagship show, Monday Night Raw. In the face of the shocking news, they canceled the planned broadcast and replaced it with a 3-hour tribute to the life and career of Chris Benoit. Announcers and fellow wrestlers, many still unaware of the full, horrifying truth, shared tearful memories of their fallen friend. But as the grim details of the murder-suicide emerged over the next 24 hours, the tribute became a source of profound corporate embarrassment. The hero they had just eulogized was a monster. In a stunning reversal, WWE began the process of erasing Chris Benoit from its history. His name was scrubbed from their website, his merchandise pulled, his matches removed from their archives. The man who had been a world champion became a ghost, a name that could not be spoken. The media frenzy was immediate and intense. The initial narrative, fueled by sensationalist reporting, coalesced around a single, explosive explanation: roid rage. Toxicology reports confirmed that Benoit had an elevated level of testosterone in his system at the time of his death, 10 times the normal amount, the result of a recent injection. Steroids were found throughout the house. The story was simple and seductive. A muscle-bound wrestler, pumped full of performance-enhancing drugs, had flown into an uncontrollable rage and annihilated his family. But for the investigators, and for those who knew the complexities of the case, this explanation was woefully incomplete. A roid rage might explain a single impulsive act of violence, but it could not account for the chilling, methodical nature of the 3-day ordeal. The binding of Nancy, the sedation of Daniel, the final, deliberate texts. There had to be something more, a deeper, more insidious cause. The search for that cause led back to the wrestling ring itself. Christopher Nowinski, a Harvard-educated neuroscientist and former WWE wrestler who had been forced to retire due to post-concussion syndrome, suspected another culprit. He knew the brutal toll the business took on the brain. He had spoken to Benoit before about concussions, and Chris had admitted to having had more than I can count. Nowinski reached out to Michael Benoit, Chris's grieving father, and made an unprecedented request: to have his son's brain tissue examined for signs of trauma. The family agreed. The brain was sent to Dr. Julian Bales at West Virginia University, a leading expert on sports-related head injuries. The results were catastrophic. Bales reported that Benoit's brain was so severely damaged it resembled the brain of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. He had an advanced, devastating form of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, a degenerative brain disease caused by repeated head trauma. All 4 lobes of his brain and his brainstem were ravaged by tau protein deposits, the telltale sign of the disease. It was a level of damage Dr. Bales had seen before in the brains of retired NFL players who had descended into depression, paranoia, and violence. Suddenly, Benoit's erratic behavior in the months leading up to the murders took on a new, terrifying clarity. The paranoia, the mood swings, the memory loss, they were all classic symptoms of advanced CTE. The diving headbutt, his signature move for over 20 years, had been a slow-motion suicide, each impact another small nail in his coffin. He had essentially destroyed his own brain for the entertainment of millions. The rabid Wolverine persona was not just an act. It was a prophecy of the neurological chaos raging within him. The tragedy of Chris Benoit was not the result of a single cause. It was a toxic confluence of factors. The CTE had destroyed the hardware of his brain, leaving him prone to paranoia and rage. The constant, agonizing physical pain from his years in the ring led to a dependency on painkillers. The pressure to maintain a superhuman physique in a culture awash with steroids led him to abuse performance-enhancing drugs, which likely exacerbated his psychological instability. And the profound grief from losing many of his closest friends in the business, most notably Eddie Guerrero in 2005, had plunged him into a deep depression. He was a man drowning from all sides. In the end, the story of Chris Benoit is a dark parable about the hidden costs of a brutal spectacle. His death ripped the curtain back on the world of professional wrestling, exposing a culture of pain, addiction, and a shocking disregard for the long-term health of its athletes. It sparked a federal investigation into steroid distribution in the sport and forced WWE to implement a more rigorous wellness program. But for Nancy and Daniel Benoit, those changes came far too late. They were the ultimate victims, their lives extinguished by a man who was both a monster and, in many ways, a victim himself, a champion who had sacrificed everything, including his mind and his soul, for his art, leaving behind nothing but a legacy of horror and a name that will forever be synonymous with the darkest chapter in the history of professional wrestling. Story 6. The air in Cape Town was thick with the scent of blooming jacarandas as Annie Hindocha and Shreen Duani stepped off their flight at Cape Town International Airport on November 12, 2010. The newlyweds, their hands intertwined, carried the glow of a couple still basking in the euphoria of their wedding. Annie, a 28-year-old Swedish woman of Indian descent, had a radiant smile that seemed to capture the sunlight filtering through the terminal's glass walls. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her eyes sparkled with anticipation for the honeymoon ahead. Shreen, a 30-year-old British businessman from Bristol, stood beside her, his demeanor calm but attentive, his tailored suit a quiet nod to his success as a care home owner. They had just come from a lavish wedding in Mumbai, a 3-day affair filled with vibrant saris, golden lights, and the rhythmic beat of doll drums. Now, in South Africa, they were ready to embark on a journey that promised adventure and intimacy, a celebration of their new life together. As they navigated the bustling airport, a man approached them with a warm smile and an outstretched hand. Zola Tongo, a local taxi driver, had a wiry frame and an easy charm that put the couple at ease. His taxi, a silver VW Chiron, gleamed under the African sun, and he offered to be their guide for the duration of their stay in Cape Town. Annie, ever curious and eager to experience the world, was delighted by the idea. Shreen, more reserved, nodded in agreement, trusting Tongo's local knowledge to show them the city's hidden gems. They climbed into the taxi, their luggage stowed in the back, and set off toward the Cape Grace Hotel, a 5-star oasis nestled along the Victoria and Alfred waterfront. The hotel's opulent interiors, with their polished marble floors and sweeping views of Table Mountain, promised a luxurious respite. But Annie's heart was set on something more authentic, a glimpse into the real South Africa, beyond the polished veneer of tourist havens. The couple's first few days were a whirlwind of beauty and exploration. They had spent the early part of their honeymoon on a safari in Kruger National Park, where the vast savanna stretched endlessly before them, dotted with elephants and giraffes. Annie had laughed as she snapped photos, her excitement infectious. Now in Cape Town, they dined at upscale restaurants, strolled along the waterfront, and marveled at the city's blend of modernity and raw, untamed beauty. But on the evening of November 13th, Annie's desire for a deeper connection to the place led them to a decision that would alter their lives forever. She wanted to see the real Africa, as she put it, a phrase that carried both innocence and a yearning for something unfiltered. Shreen later claimed it was Annie who insisted on venturing into Gugulethu, a township known for its vibrant community, but also its high crime rate. Tongo, ever accommodating, agreed to drive them there for dinner, a detour that took them far from the safety of the city's tourist districts. As the taxi wound through the streets of Gugulethu, the vibrant chaos of the township unfolded around them. Shacks lined the roads, their corrugated iron roofs glinting under streetlights. Music spilled from open windows, and groups of people gathered at roadside stalls, their voices mingling in a lively cacophony. Annie peered out the window, her curiosity piqued, while Shreen sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Tongo's hands gripped the steering wheel, his expression unreadable. The couple had dined earlier at a restaurant in the township, an experience Annie found exhilarating. Now, as night fell, they were returning to their hotel, the taxi's headlights cutting through the darkness. But the journey took a sudden, terrifying turn. Two armed men emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by the night. One brandished a gun, its barrel glinting as he barked orders in a language Annie and Shreen couldn't understand. Tongo slowed the taxi, his movements deliberate, as the men forced their way into the vehicle. The air inside the car grew thick with fear. Annie's breath caught in her throat, her fingers tightening around Shreen's hand. The hijackers, later identified as Zolal Mjini and Mzwamadoda Quabe, were young, their movements erratic but purposeful. They ordered Tongo to pull over, and in a chaotic moment, Shreen was forced out of the car, left standing on a deserted street as the taxi sped away with Annie still inside. He stumbled toward a nearby house, his heart pounding, and knocked on the door of a resident named Simbinal Matakazi. "Excuse me," Shreen said, his voice trembling. "Is there a nearby police station where I can report a hijack?" The next morning, November 14th, 2010, the sun rose over Cape Town, but its warmth did little to dispel the chill that had settled over the city. In a quiet corner of Khayelitsha, another township near Gugulethu, a silver VW Chiron sat abandoned. Inside, on the back seat, lay the body of Annie Douani. She had been shot in the neck, her life extinguished in a single brutal moment. Her handbag was missing, and her body bore no signs of sexual assault, a detail that would later spark questions among investigators and the public alike. The Western Cape Police launched a murder investigation, their sirens cutting through the morning air as they cordoned off the scene. Annie's death sent shockwaves through South Africa and beyond. Her radiant wedding photos splashed across newspapers, a stark contrast to the grim reality of her fate. The headline in the Daily Mail screamed honeymoon horror, capturing the tragedy of a young woman murdered just weeks after her wedding day. In London, Annie's family was shattered. Vinod Hindocha, her father, sat in his home in Mariestad, Sweden, his face etched with grief. He was a man who had known hardship, having fled Uganda in 1972 under Idi Amin's expulsion of Asians, arriving in Sweden with little more than hope. Annie, born in Mariestad in 1982, had grown up in a close-knit family, her warmth and ambition lighting up their lives. She had studied engineering in Stockholm, her intelligence matched only by her zest for life. When she met Shreen in London in 2009, their long-distance romance blossomed into an engagement, culminating in the extravagant Mumbai wedding. Now Vinod's world had collapsed. His daughter, the girl who had danced under a full moon in a golden sari, was gone. Her mother, Nilam, wept silently, clutching a photo of Annie, while her uncle, Ashok Hindocha, vowed to seek justice. "We cannot heal," he said, "until the truth is known." Back in South Africa, the police moved swiftly. Within days, 3 men were arrested. Zolal Mjini, a 26-year-old from Khayelitsha with a frail frame and a malignant brain tumor. Mzwamadoda Quabe, a 26-year-old neighbor of Mjini. And Mond Mbalambo, a hotel receptionist who had connections to Tongo. The arrests painted a picture of a botched robbery. but the story soon grew more complex. Tongo, the couple's trusted driver, was arrested on November 20th, his face hidden under a white sheet as he was led into Weinberg Magistrate's Court. In a stunning turn, he confessed to his role in the crime, claiming it was no random hijacking, but a premeditated murder orchestrated by Shreen Duani himself. Tongo alleged that Shreen had offered him 15,000 rand, roughly 1,400 pounds, to arrange Annie's death, staging it to look like a carjacking. The accusation sent shockwaves through the case, transforming Shreen from a grieving widower to the prime suspect. Shreen, who had returned to the UK just 4 days after Annie's death, was reeling. His family, led by his brother Priyen, dismissed Tongo's claims as totally ludicrous, suggesting the South African authorities were desperate to pin the crime on a foreigner to protect their tourism industry. 2 weeks have been spent negotiating this confession, Priyen said, hinting at coercion or torture. But the allegations stuck, and on December 8, 2010, Shreen was arrested in Bristol at the request of South African authorities. He appeared at the City of Westminster Magistrates' Court, his face pale, his eyes downcast. The extradition process began, a legal battle that would stretch over years, fueled by concerns over Shreen's mental health. Diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and severe depression, he was admitted to a psychiatric facility, his lawyers arguing that he was unfit to stand trial in South Africa. The case gripped the public imagination, its details dissected in newsrooms and living rooms alike. Annie's beauty, the fairy tale wedding, and the brutal murder made for a story that was both heartbreaking and sensational. But beneath the headlines lay a web of contradictions. Tongo's confession, secured through a plea deal under Section 105A of the Criminal Procedure Act, painted Shreen as the mastermind, but his story shifted under scrutiny. He initially claimed Annie had insisted on visiting Gugulethu, but later said it was his own suggestion. Quabe and Balambo, also offered plea deals, corroborated Tongo's account, but their testimonies were riddled with inconsistencies. Balambo admitted to lying in previous affidavits, and Quabe refused to explain why Annie was driven to a residential area. Crucially, alleged text messages between Shreen and Tongo about the murder plot could not be recovered, undermining the prosecution's case. As the investigation deepened, questions arose about the nature of Shreen and Annie's relationship. Reports surfaced of tension in their marriage, with Annie sending desperate emails to Shreen just days after their wedding, questioning his feelings for her. Rumors swirled about Shreen's sexuality, with allegations that he had met with male escorts before and during their marriage. Annie's family, devastated by these revelations, expressed shock and betrayal. Which father would allow their daughter to marry a man who sleeps with men? Vinod asked, his voice heavy with pain. Yet, a BBC Panorama documentary later suggested the couple was trying for a baby, casting doubt on claims that Shreen's secret life motivated the murder. The documentary also raised the possibility that Annie's death was accidental, the result of a struggle during a robbery gone wrong. In South Africa, the wheels of justice turned slowly. Njini, despite his initial confession, pleaded not guilty in 2012, claiming an alibi and alleging his confession was extracted under torture. Justice Robert Henney rejected these claims, and Njini was convicted of murder, sentenced to life in prison. Quabe, who had pleaded guilty, received 25 years, while Balambo was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, though Judge Jeanette Traverso later deemed his evidence unreliable. Tongo was sentenced to 18 years, his plea deal contingent on testifying against Shreen. The case against Shreen, however, hinged on these flawed witnesses, whose contradictions would haunt the trial. The extradition saga dragged on, a legal tug-of-war between the UK and South Africa. Shreen's lawyers argued that his mental health made him unfit for trial, citing the risk of chronic illness if extradited. Psychiatrist Nigel Eastman testified that Shreen needed at least 6 months to recover, while Dr. Ian Cumming countered that delay could worsen his condition. In 2013, a UK court ruled Shreen fit for extradition, a decision upheld by Home Secretary Theresa May despite appeals. Annie's family, desperate for answers, handed a petition with 11,411 signatures to the Home Office, urging Shreen's return to South Africa. Finally, in April 2014, Shreen was extradited, landing in Cape Town under heavy security. He faced 5 charges, including murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy, his fate resting on a trial that would captivate the world. The trial began in October 2014 at the Western Cape High Court, a modern building with stark white walls and a palpable air of tension. Shreen sat in the dock, his once confident demeanor replaced by a quiet intensity. The prosecution, led by Rodney de Kock, painted a damning picture. A man who had orchestrated his wife's murder to escape a marriage he no longer wanted. Quabe took the stand, his voice steady as he recounted Tongo's claim that a husband wanted his wife killed. He described the hijacking, admitting he had lied in earlier hearings to secure a lighter sentence. Under cross-examination by Shreen's barrister, Francois Van Zyl, Quabe's story unraveled. He could not explain key details, such as why Annie was driven to a residential area or how the fatal shot was fired. Tongo and Balombo fared no better, their testimonies marked by fabricated phone calls and contradictory statements. Van Zyl proposed 2 alternate theories: a robbery gone wrong or a botched kidnapping for ransom. Forensic evidence suggested Annie may have been shot accidentally as she struggled to keep her handbag, the bullet ricocheting off her hand and into her neck. A witness, Bernard Mitchell, claimed Tongo had confessed in prison to a failed ransom plot, a detail that muddied the prosecution's narrative. The police investigation itself came under fire, with lost pocketbooks, unsigned statements, and forgotten forensic evidence exposing a litany of errors. Judge Traverso, a seasoned jurist with a reputation for fairness, listened intently, her expression unreadable as the prosecution's case crumbled. On November 24, 2014, Van Zyl moved for dismissal under Section 174 of the Criminal Procedure Act, arguing that the prosecution lacked credible evidence linking Shreen to the crime. On December 8, Judge Traverso delivered her ruling. The courtroom was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. "There is no evidence on which a reasonable court can convict the accused," she said, her voice steady. "The application for dismissal is granted." Shreen Duani was acquitted, exonerated of all charges. Annie's family, seated in the gallery, sat in stunned silence, their hopes for justice dashed. Traverso acknowledged their pain, noting the many unanswered questions in the case, but ruled that Shreen could not be compelled to testify. She also refused to grant Balombo immunity, citing his unreliable testimony. Shreen left the courtroom a free man, returning to the UK the next day. The aftermath was a storm of grief and controversy. Annie's family, unwilling to accept the verdict, pushed for a UK inquest to compel Shreen to answer questions. In September 2015, Coroner Andrew Walker ruled against a full inquest, citing the South African trial's findings. "I am prohibited from reaching a conclusion inconsistent with the South African courts," he said, closing the door on further legal recourse. Vinod and Nilam Hindocha were left to mourn in private, their daughter's ashes scattered over Lake Vänern, a quiet lake in Sweden where they had built a new life after fleeing Uganda. Ashok Hindocha, speaking for the family in 2018, acknowledged Shreen's acquittal but condemned his deception, particularly regarding his sexuality. "We accept he did not murder Annie," Ashok said, "but he lied to us." The men convicted in Annie's death faced their own fates. Zola Mjini died in prison in October 2014, his brain tumor claiming his life. Mzawamadoda Quabe remains incarcerated, eligible for parole in 2027. Zola Tongo, whose testimony sparked the case against Shreen, serves an 18-year sentence, his release a distant prospect. Mon Balombo, despite his role, walked free, his immunity deal a bitter point of contention for Annie's family. The South African police faced criticism for their handling of the case, with allegations of incompetence and political pressure to protect the country's tourism image. A BBC Panorama documentary, aired in 2012, had already questioned the prosecution's narrative, highlighting inconsistencies and suggesting the possibility of an accidental shooting. In the years since, the case has lingered in the public consciousness, a haunting reminder of a life cut short and a justice system that failed to provide closure. Annie's story, once a fairy tale of love and celebration, became a tragedy marked by betrayal, loss, and unanswered questions. In Marystad, Vinod Hindocha drives past Lake Vänern, where his daughter's ashes drift in the wind, a silent tribute to a woman whose light was extinguished too soon. In Bristol, Shreen Duani lives quietly, his life forever altered by the events of that November night. The truth of what happened in Gugulethu remains elusive, a shadow cast over a story that began with love and ended in heartbreak.